My husband said our marriage was over unless I let his best friend move in. Then I discovered the truth he hid for weeks. My husband once threatened to divorce me because I refused to let his best friend move into my home office. Sunday dinners used to be the one part of the week that felt peaceful and completely mine. My name is Naomi, and back then, my Sundays were simple. I'd finish the laundry I'd been avoiding, throw something easy in the oven, pour a glass of wine, and sit at the little table by the window with my husband. Most of the time, it was just the two of us talking about normal married life. Jobs, rent, whose turn it was to call maintenance about the leaking faucet. Then my husband's best friend started becoming a regular part of those Sundays. At first, I didn't think much of it. They'd been friends since they were teenagers. He'd helped us carry a couch up 4 flights of stairs when we moved in. He'd stood beside us at our wedding. I never saw him as a stranger barging into my life. I saw him as part of my husband's world, and by extension, part of ours. Looking back, that's exactly why I tolerated so much for so long. What started as an occasional weekend visit slowly became almost every weekend. A Saturday hangout turned into him staying through dinner, passing out on our couch, waking up the next morning and asking what we were making for breakfast like he lived there. He stopped texting before coming over. He'd knock once and try the handle because my husband had apparently told him that was fine. His things started appearing everywhere. A phone charger by the couch, a sweatshirt over a chair, sneakers by the door, and one deeply annoying travel mug that somehow ended up in our sink every single time I cleaned the kitchen. My husband thought it was hilarious. "Look at him, he's nesting," he joked once while his friend rifled through our cabinets for snacks. I laughed along because it was easier than admitting how irritated I actually was. And I wasn't some confident woman calmly setting boundaries from day one. I wasn't. I made annoyed faces when nobody was looking. I slammed cabinets a little too hard. I gave short answers. I complained to my own friend by text while telling my husband everything was fine. Very mature, extremely effective. It's easy now to look back and wonder why I let it slide as far as it did. I've asked myself that more times than I want to admit. Part of it was that he really had been good to us in the past. He was the one who showed up with a truck when we needed to move a couch, who remembered my birthday before some of my own family did. It felt petty to complain about a guy who'd been kind to us for a decade. So instead of saying anything directly, I did the passive-aggressive dance. I left his charger unplugged in a drawer once just to see if he'd notice. He didn't. I stopped restocking the snacks he liked. My husband restocked them himself. Every small test I ran just proved that my husband was more invested in his friend's comfort than in reading the signals I was sending. The real issue was that I worked from home for a financial services company, and the second bedroom wasn't a cute little side desk. It was my entire office. I spent my whole workday in there, handling client reports, video meetings, and spreadsheets where one wrong decimal could ruin my week. I needed quiet. My husband's friend had a laugh loud enough to hear from the parking lot. One Friday, he showed up around lunch while I was mid-meeting with my supervisor. He and my husband started watching something in the living room, yelling and clapping every few minutes, arguing with whatever was on the screen. I muted myself 3 separate times. At one point, my supervisor actually paused and asked, "Is everything okay over there?" I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. When the call ended, I walked out and asked them, as calmly as I could manage, to keep it down while I was working. My husband looked at me like I'd wandered into someone else's apartment and made an insane request. "You could just work from the kitchen when he's here," he said. I laughed, genuinely thinking he was joking. He wasn't. The kitchen was 20 feet from the television, with 0 separation and 0 door. My office had a door. That was the point. His friend went quiet and stared at his phone. My husband rolled his eyes and said I was making things awkward. Somehow by the end of that conversation, I was the one apologizing for my tone, not the fact that 2 grown men were shouting outside my home office in the middle of a workday. I still think about that. My tone became the emergency, not the yelling. After that, things went back to normal within a weekend. My Sunday dinners basically disappeared because my husband always wanted his friend included. When I invited my own friend, I had to warn her he'd probably be there too. Once she asked if he'd moved in, and I joked, "Not officially." That joke aged badly. By the time the real conversation happened, my husband and I had been married 6 years and together 13. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment that worked as long as both of us kept working, and neither car became an emergency. We weren't rich, but I thought we were stable. I used to tell people that with a kind of quiet pride, that we weren't the couple constantly fighting about money, that we'd built something steady out of 2 ordinary incomes and a lot of careful budgeting. Looking back, I think that pride made me slower to notice the cracks. I wanted so badly for us to be the couple who had it figured out that I ignored the parts of our life that clearly didn't. It was a Sunday night right after dinner. His friend had left about an hour earlier, rare enough that I remember enjoying the quiet. I just loaded the last plate into the dishwasher when my husband said, "We need to talk about something." He was sitting at the table, both hands around a glass of water, wearing the careful expression he used when he'd already decided something was reasonable before I'd even heard it. His friend's lease was ending in about 8 weeks. The rent was going up, and he didn't want to renew. According to my husband, the obvious solution was for him to move in with us, temporarily. I waited for the rest of the plan. There wasn't one. Where would he sleep? I asked. In the office. My office? It's the second bedroom. Yes, and it's my office. We can move your desk. Where? Maybe the kitchen or the living room. The same kitchen he'd already suggested I work from while his friend watched TV 20 feet away. I asked how long temporary meant. He didn't know. I asked how much his friend would contribute. They'd figure it out. I asked if our property manager even allowed another adult on the lease. He said that could be handled later. Every answer was a shrug wearing a sentence. I told him I needed time to think, not because I was considering it, but because I was trying not to scream. My home had already started feeling like a clubhouse I was allowed to clean. Now he wanted the one room that helped pay for it. His face went cold. "I thought you'd understand," he said. "Understand what? You haven't explained anything. He needs help, and I need a place to work. He's my best friend. I'm your wife." I hated how childish that sounded the second it left my mouth, like I was asking him to choose a favorite. But that was how he'd framed it, not me. He stood up, said he didn't want to argue, and shut himself in the bedroom. I sat at the table shaking with anger and immediately started questioning whether I was being selfish. That was a pattern with me, and I could feel something completely reasonable and then put it on trial within seconds. Was I being territorial? Was I turning a temporary housing problem into something bigger than it needed to be? Plenty of people help friends out when rent gets too expensive. Maybe I could work from the bedroom for a few weeks. Maybe we could set actual rules. No coming in after 9, no using my desk, a real end date in writing. I sat there rewriting the whole arrangement in my head, trying to find a version of it I could live with. Then I looked at his friend's travel mug sitting in my drying rack again and had the very mature thought that I wanted to throw it out the window. About 55 minutes later, he came back, calm. That's what bothered me most. If he'd stormed back in yelling, I could have written it off as emotional. Instead, he sat across from me, looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you won't let him move in, then I want a divorce." No shaking voice, no hesitation, just a decision already made. I didn't say anything. He must have expected me to panic and cave because when I didn't react, he leaned in and said, "I'm serious." I grabbed my keys and left. I drove for an hour with no destination, passed the same grocery store twice, cried at a red light, then got angry at myself for crying, which made me cry harder. 13 years, reduced to whether his best friend could have my office. Part of me wanted to go home and call his bluff. Another part wanted to just agree and make the threat disappear, which is humiliating to admit, but true. When someone you love puts the whole relationship on the table, your first instinct isn't always dignity. Sometimes it's bargaining. I didn't cave, but not because I was strong. I was too shocked to decide anything. When I got home, he was already in bed, facing the wall. I slept on the couch. The next morning, he made coffee, asked if I needed anything from the store, and kissed the side of my head before work like nothing had happened. For the next 3 days, neither of us mentioned the ultimatum. I just watched him more closely. Same routine every day. Laptop bag, same complaints about traffic. My husband had never been decisive about anything in his life. This was a man who spent a month comparing vacuum cleaners, who read half a restaurant's menu online before he'd even agree to go there, who once returned a mattress because he needed to think about it more after already sleeping on it for 2 weeks. Yet somehow he'd decided in under an hour that he was willing to end our marriage over an 8-week housing problem. It didn't feel impulsive anymore. It felt prepared. And once that thought got into my head, I couldn't get it back out. I started replaying every conversation from the last month, looking for a version of him planning this quietly in the background, while I had no idea anything was wrong. What finally gave me something concrete was the bank account. We had a joint account for rent, utilities, groceries, all the unglamorous stuff. Both paychecks went in. I usually just checked the balance and moved on. 4 days after the ultimatum, I opened it to calculate what adding another adult would cost us. I expected to see his paycheck near the top. It wasn't there. I scrolled back a week. Nothing. His last deposit had landed almost a month earlier. My stomach dropped. There was enough cushion in the account that nothing had bounced, and which is exactly why I hadn't noticed. When he got home, I tried to sound casual. "Did something change with payroll?" He paused, taking off his shoes. Just a second, but I saw it. "What do you mean?" "Your paycheck hasn't hit the joint account in 4 weeks. He looked away and started sorting mail. There's some issue with payroll. They're fixing it. What kind of issue lasts 4 weeks? He sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. I don't know. Some administrative thing. They're handling it. No frustration, no explanation, no proof. Just a quick subject change to what we were having for dinner. This was a man who once called a delivery place 6 times over a missing side of fries. He did not sit calmly with an unresolved grievance, but an entire month of missing paychecks left him completely relaxed. I didn't push that night. I was scared of what I'd find. It was easier to let him make pasta and talk about a fake problem at work than to ask the question already screaming in my head. Had he lost his job? I lay awake most of that night, running through every alternative explanation I could think of. A payroll system switch, an HR error, anything that didn't end with him lying to my face for a month. None of them made sense once I actually thought them through. A payroll glitch doesn't last 4 weeks without a single email. An HR error doesn't get explained away with a shrug and a change of subject. The next morning, I watched him from the window. Laptop bag, travel mug, quick kiss goodbye. The whole performance memorized down to the last detail. By lunch, a horrible theory had formed. His friend had income. If he moved in and paid rent, my husband could hide his missing salary indefinitely, dress it up as helping a friend while I lost my office and absorbed more than my share of the bills. He wasn't trying to help his friend. He was trying to solve something, and I still didn't know what. Early the next week, while I was mid-report, the property manager called. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't recognize the number. She introduced herself and said they'd received a request to add another adult to our lease. My husband had submitted initial information, but they needed my authorization too. I stood up so fast my chair rolled into the wall. I did not approve that. There was a pause on her end, and her voice got noticeably more careful. She explained that no change could be finalized without both leaseholders signing, which was why she was calling. I told her clearly that I did not consent, not verbally, not in writing, in any form, and asked her to note it. She assured me nothing would move forward without me. Then I asked when the request had been submitted, 3 days before my husband had even sat me down to ask me. That detail landed harder than anything else. The conversation at our kitchen table had never been real. He wasn't asking my opinion. He was waiting for me to catch up to a decision he'd already made official. I spent 13 minutes pacing before texting him. The property manager just called. Come home after work. We need to talk. He replied, about what? I actually laughed out loud. You know what? I sent back. He didn't respond and came home an hour later than usual to find me at the table with my laptop open to the bank account and a notebook beside it. It looked like an interrogation. Kind of was. He set his keys down slowly. I was just trying to get ahead of the paperwork, he said. You submitted it before you even asked me. Why are you making this bigger than it is? That almost broke something. You threatened divorce when I didn't immediately agree. You changed our lease behind my back. Your paychecks disappeared and your explanation makes no sense. Tell me what's actually happening. His eyes flicked to the laptop screen and his tone shifted from defensive to angry. Not guilty, angry. You're looking for reasons not to trust me. No, I said. I found reasons. He insisted the payroll thing had nothing to do with his friend, that the lease request was just preliminary, that the ultimatum had been stupid, but I was also being unfair to his best friend. I kept asking the same question, why hasn't your salary come in? And he kept answering everything except that until he finally said he was tired and went to shower. The next morning, he left at the same time as always. By then, I'd basically stopped believing he was going to work. 6 days later, his friend showed up at our door with 4 boxes, a duffel bag, and that same ridiculous travel mug under one arm. My husband had left less than an hour earlier to run errands. I opened the door and froze. Hey, his friend said, easy and smiling, the same casual grin he always wore, like nothing about this was strange at all. Figured I'd start bringing some smaller stuff over. One box said books. Another had kitchen items sticking out the top, a mug handle poking through the flaps. This wasn't a visit. This was moving day, and apparently I was the only person in the building who hadn't been told. No, I said. You're not moving in. His smile disappeared. He said you agreed. I did not. He said the paperwork was basically done. The paperwork he submitted without telling me. I canceled it. He set the box down, genuinely confused now. Wait, he told me you were okay with this. I asked for time to think. Then he threatened to divorce me if I said no. His whole face changed. He what? For one ugly second, I wondered if they'd planned this together. Then I asked, you knew his paycheck stopped coming into our account, right? He went completely still. That was the answer. I knew he lost his job, he admitted quietly. I thought you knew too. The hallway seemed to tilt. He'd lost his job about a month earlier. He told me you two were handling it. He said payroll had a delay. I laughed. Nothing funny in it. His friend swore under his breath, looking sick now, and told me the real arrangement. My husband said I'd already agreed he could use the office in exchange for a fixed monthly amount toward rent and utilities. How much? I asked. He told me the number. It was almost exactly what my husband normally contributed toward rent and utilities every month. Of course it was. His friend kept apologizing, saying he'd never have shown up with boxes if he'd known I actually said no. I believed him more than I wanted to. He wasn't even trying to push past me into the apartment anymore. If anything, he was backing away. Then my husband rounded the corner carrying 3 grocery bags and stopped cold. Nobody spoke. Finally, his friend said, "You told me she agreed." My husband looked at me, not him. We were still discussing it. "No," I said. "You told him I agree. You told him the paperwork was basically finished." My husband lowered his voice, glancing at the hallway. "Can we not do this out here?" I almost screamed. "You brought a man here with moving boxes and now you're worried about privacy?" His friend reached for the box my husband tried to grab and asked the question that ended the performance for good. "Did you tell her you got fired?" My husband's face went white. No more payroll delay. No more careful acting. His friend said he was leaving. My husband told him not to make it worse, and his friend said flatly, "I'm not the one who made this." He carried his boxes back toward the stairs, and my husband turned to me with this exhausted, resentful look, like the two of us had ruined a perfectly reasonable plan. I stepped aside and let him in. "Tell me everything," I said. "Right now." He'd been fired a little over a month earlier, not out of nowhere either. Chronic lateness, dropped performance, missed deadlines, prior warnings. "Why didn't you tell me?" I was embarrassed. So you pretended to go to work every day?" He'd been applying from coffee shops with his laptop bag, hoping to land something before I noticed. 2 weeks in, he panicked. His friend had already mentioned the rent hike, and my husband saw a solution. His friend moves in, contributes money, buys him time. Your solution was my office. It was the only extra room. It wasn't extra. You mean I could have adjusted? Oh, he said I was fixated on the wrong thing. He'd lost his job, he was scared. Like that erased everything else. That was the moment I stopped crying and went cold. You threatened me with divorce. I was desperate. You changed the lease behind my back. I was trying to fix it. You told your friend I agreed. I thought once you understood, you would. You never told me the situation. He kept insisting we could still make the arrangement work if I'd just calm down. Maybe his friend could take the living room instead. Maybe a divider. Maybe it would only be a few more weeks now that everything was out in the open. As if honesty 3 weeks late fixed anything, he brought up my childhood. Growing up in a house where money was always tight, how he didn't want me to spiral. That part actually hurt because it was true. I do check due dates too often. I do keep emergency savings because my version of a childhood emergency was the power getting shut off. He knew that about me, and instead of trusting me with the truth, he used my fear as permission to lie. You didn't protect me from stress, I told him. You let me keep paying bills while you built a plan around me. When I asked if he understood this wasn't only about money, he genuinely asked, then what else could it possibly be about? I told him to sleep on the couch. He laughed in disbelief. This is my home too. The same man who'd been ready to end our marriage over that exact home 24 hours earlier. Around 4 a.m, I searched our old messages for words like meeting and traffic and found dozens of small, ordinary lies. A stressful meeting that never happened, a coworker who didn't exist, deadlines that were fiction. Somehow the little lies hurt worse than one big confession would have. I texted him from one room away. "How many times were you going to lie before you told me?" No answer. The next morning he apologized, and for a moment it sounded real, until he added, "But I need you to understand why I did it." The apology came with homework. Over the next few days, he cycled between remorse and irritation, still floating the same fix. Maybe his friend could sleep in the living room instead, put up a divider, a few more weeks. His friend had never agreed to any of it. You're still trying to make him move in? I'm trying to keep us afloat. I told him our savings were disappearing because he'd been fired for acting like a teenager and then spent weeks in costume, pretending to go to work. I regretted it instantly, but I was also furious he'd found a sentence that let him play the victim. He packed a bag and left for his friend's place, who let him stay, out of loyalty, but who also stopped answering my husband's attempts to revive the moving plan. The apartment went unnaturally quiet. I wandered from room to room, checking things that didn't need checking, the stove, the front door lock, the thermostat, as if the quiet itself needed supervision. I'd open the fridge, stare at it, and close it again without taking anything out. I caught myself setting 2 coffee cups out one morning before remembering there was only going to be one of us that day. That week, I made a small mistake on a report. My supervisor asked if something was wrong, and I lied about not sleeping well before crying at my desk the second the call ended. I called my closest friend and told her everything. She said, he didn't make one scared decision. He built a system. She was right. And the fake commute, the fake stories, the hidden job loss, the arrangement with his friend, the lease request, the ultimatum, none of it was panic. Each lie was propping up the one before it. 3 days later, I hired a divorce lawyer. She was calm and practical, and never once told me what to feel about any of it, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I explained that we rented, had no kids, owned nothing major beyond furniture, savings, and 2 older cars. I laid out the job loss, the hidden plan, the lease request, the ultimatum. She gave me instructions instead of sympathy. Save everything: messages, bank records, the lease correspondence, anything showing the attempted change. Don't change the locks. He was still a legal tenant. Open a separate account and redirect my paycheck, but keep enough in the joint one to cover what we'd already committed to. I left that meeting feeling steadier and sick at the same time. That same afternoon, I opened a new account. The next morning, I redirected my deposit. I spent that whole week dismantling my marriage through paperwork. 1 password change, 1 redirected deposit, 1 saved screenshot at a time. It felt less like grief and more like administrative work, which was somehow easier to manage. My husband kept texting from his friend's place, apologetic at first. Then he noticed my paycheck had stopped landing in the joint account. Did you move your salary? Yes. Without talking to me, that's a huge decision. I actually laughed at the message. You submitted a lease request without talking to me, I replied. He said those things weren't comparable. I didn't answer. Whenever I asked about interviews, he had vague non-answers. A recruiter had looked at his application. Someone might call soon. The same phrases stretched out over days until they stopped meaning anything. Once he accused me of asking in a judgmental tone. I told him there was no safe tone for asking why my unemployed husband was still lying to me. That night, he sent a voice message, several minutes long, saying I'd abandoned him at the worst moment of his life, that marriages were supposed to survive job loss, that I'd apparently decided he was worthless the moment he stopped contributing money. He barely mentioned the threat, the lease, or the lies. Those parts were almost entirely missing, like they hadn't happened. I listened to it twice, hoping I'd somehow missed the part where he took responsibility. I hadn't. I forwarded it to my friend and immediately felt guilty since it was technically private. She called back and asked, "Do you want honesty or comfort?" "Honesty. He still thinks the job loss is the crime and your reaction is the punishment," she said. "He doesn't understand that the lying is the thing." I knew she was right. I told the lawyer to file. The petition went in during the 5th week after that Sunday dinner. He didn't know yet. I walked around for days carrying that secret like something physical, feeling like I'd crossed an invisible line even though nothing in the apartment looked any different. His shoes were still by the closet. His coffee was still in the cabinet. Our wedding photo was still sitting on the bookshelf, both of us smiling at a version of our life that no longer existed, but hadn't been packed away yet either. I almost called twice to stop it. Once after finding one of his old shirts in the laundry and crying into it. Once after he sent a job application screenshot with the message, "See, I'm trying." For a few minutes, I let myself imagine counseling, separate finances, staying married. Then I remembered. The lease request had been submitted before he ever asked me. That conversation was never real. That was the part I couldn't get past. He was served at his friend's apartment in the 6th week and called me immediately. I answered because I'd been told there might be practical questions to sort out. The second I heard his voice, I knew there would be nothing practical about it. "You filed for divorce?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" The hypocrisy of that question left me speechless for a second. He accused me of humiliating him in front of his friend, of turning a temporary financial problem into a legal attack, then asked the question he'd repeat to other people for months afterward. The one he seemed to think was some kind of trump card. "You're really ending 13 years over a room?" "It was never about the room," I said. And I meant it more than I'd meant almost anything else in that entire conversation. "I'm talking about the fact that you promised my workspace to someone else, tried to change our lease without consent, hid your firing, lied every day, and threatened divorce the second I didn't agree." He said the ultimatum didn't count. Heat of the moment. I reminded him he'd left the room for almost an hour, then come back calm. "You thought about it," I said. "You came back calm." Long pause. Then, "I thought if I made it serious, you'd stop saying no." I closed my eyes. He tried explaining. He knew I was afraid of divorce because my parents' split had been ugly. He thought I'd understand how desperate he was. He never actually wanted to leave me. "You wanted me scared enough to do what you wanted." I said, "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you just admitted." Oh, he started crying, and that, not the anger, and it was the hardest part. It dragged up every good memory at once. cheap road trips, our first tiny apartment, the night he stayed up with me when my mother was in the hospital. Betrayal doesn't erase love. It just makes leaving harder. He asked me to withdraw the filing. I said no. He asked if there was someone else. I told him no, and that he was the one who'd put our marriage on the table as a threat, not me. Before hanging up, he said, "You're going to regret doing this while you're angry." I said, "I'm doing it because I'm finally not confused." My hand shook for 25 minutes, but I never called back. A few days later, he came to collect his things while I worked from the office. I heard his key in the lock and tensed. That small mechanical click somehow felt louder than it had any right to be. He moved through the apartment, hangers scraping, tape ripping across cardboard, a drawer sliding shut harder than necessary. At one point, something dropped and he swore under his breath, and I almost stood up to help before reminding myself he was perfectly capable of picking up his own belongings. I stayed at my desk, staring at my monitors without actually reading anything on them, listening to the sound of a decade slowly being packed into boxes one room away. About an hour later, he appeared in my doorway, looking at the room like he'd never really seen it. "This is what ended us," he said. "No," I said. "You gotta keep the apartment. You gotta keep your office. I lost my job, my home, and my wife. You didn't lose them all in one accident," I told him. He flinched and I didn't take it back. He left his key on the counter and walked out without looking back. In our closet, his side was almost empty. 3 bare hangers still swinging. On the floor was a box of wedding photos. I opened it, which was a mistake. The first picture was us laughing outside the courthouse, my hair blowing across my face while he reached to move it. I closed the box, pushed it to the back of the closet, and cried on the floor for a while. Then I washed my face and went back to work, because apparently a marriage can end at 3 in the afternoon, and someone still needs a corrected forecast by 6. During the 7th week, I learned the version of the story my husband was telling other people, that I'd filed for divorce because I refused to let his best friend stay in our spare room for a while. Spare room. A woman we both knew sent me a careful message about it. She said she didn't want to get involved, but felt I should know what was being said. I started typing a full explanation, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. I told her there was more to it, but I wasn't going to relitigate my marriage through mutual friends for the next year. She replied with a heart emoji, which was kind and completely useless. That evening, his friend texted me one direct question. Had I ever actually told my husband he could move in? Part of me resented even being asked. He'd stood in my doorway and heard me say I never agreed. But then I realized my husband was probably still feeding him the same story. I answered honestly, I never agreed, and I canceled the request the second the property manager called. He told me my husband was still insisting I'd agreed and changed my mind out of anger. Their friendship had outlasted my marriage, and somehow my husband had managed to damage that too. That part actually made me sad in a way I hadn't expected. Near the end of the 8th week, the friend messaged again, longer this time. He'd confronted my husband directly, who first claimed a misunderstanding, then got angry, and accused us both of turning on him. They argued for a while, apparently loudly enough that a neighbor knocked on the wall. The friend told him to find somewhere else to live since the lease was ending, and he wasn't renewing it regardless of how things shook out between the two of them. He said he finally understood. My husband had used the move to hide the missing income and create a situation I'd feel too guilty to refuse. I didn't respond. Their friendship was theirs to repair or end. I'd spent enough time trapped in that triangle. The 8-week deadline my husband had tried to solve with my office arrived exactly on schedule. His friend moved out. My husband had to find somewhere too. Meanwhile, our biggest fight became the apartment itself. Both our names were still on the lease, and the property manager needed to confirm my income alone could cover it, since the original approval had been based on 2 incomes. For days I was terrified it wouldn't be enough. I gathered pay stubs, bank statements, employment verification, anything that proved I could handle the rent alone, and then checked my email obsessively, like every silent hour was proof I'd been foolish to think I could keep the place. That fear dragged me right back to my husband's argument. What if refusing his plan meant losing everything anyway? And I ended up paying more for somewhere smaller while he told people I'd chosen an office over a marriage? One Sunday, my friend found me at the kitchen table with a calculator and a notebook of numbers. "You've done the math 8 times, she said. 9, I corrected. "That's not going to change the answer," she said. A few days later, the approval came through and I cried standing in my kitchen. Not happiness exactly, more like relief with months of exhaustion collapsing on top of it. The office was still mine. The bedroom was still mine. The rent, unfortunately, was entirely mine too. My husband signed the release once the transfer was final. His new address was his parents' house. I found that out from paperwork, not from him. They lived several hours away, and they'd always been kind to me. Losing them was a part of the divorce I hadn't braced for. His mother called once, said she wasn't calling to pressure me, then spent 25 minutes explaining how ashamed and depressed he was. I listened, because I still cared about her. People make mistakes when they're scared, she said. Yes, they do, I answered, and said nothing else. She waited for me to soften. I didn't. When she asked if I'd consider counseling before finalizing anything, I told her the filing was already moving forward. Her tone went cold. She said she hoped I never needed the kind of grace I was refusing to give. That sentence stayed with me for days. I wanted to call her back and explain that I had loved her son, that I had considered staying, that this was never about the job loss. I even wrote the message. I never sent it. Chasing his family's approval would have kept me trapped in the same argument forever. The final agreement was painfully ordinary. Split savings, each kept a car, I kept most of the furniture and paid him a small balance. No dramatic courtroom scene, no judge delivering some speech, no moment where everyone in the room suddenly understood what had happened. We signed in separate offices, weeks apart, with 2 different notaries. Like the whole thing was a business transaction that happened to end 13 years. Before I signed, I cried quietly with the pen in my hand. My lawyer slid a box of tissues across the table and politely looked at her computer screen instead of at me, which I appreciated more than I could have explained at the time. I wasn't doubting the decision. I was grieving it. Those aren't the same thing, even though they feel almost identical while you're living through them. Months later, the apartment finally felt like mine. I moved the table closer to the window, donated decorations that made me angry to look at, replaced the couch cover instead of the couch because my budget didn't support emotional furniture purchases. Little by little, the space stopped feeling like a crime scene and started feeling like just an apartment again. My apartment, with my rules about noise and my choice of who got a key. I started having Sunday dinners again, just me and my closest friend. Way too much food out of habit. The same table by the window where all of this had technically started. Halfway through, she looked at the empty chair and asked, "Should we put a travel mug there for memory?" I laughed so hard I nearly choked. That was the first time the whole thing felt like something that had happened to me, instead of something still happening. I heard occasional updates through mutual friends. Temporary work, lost again, applying once more. I never asked whether he and his old best friend had repaired things. From what I heard, they weren't close anymore, though I had no idea if that was permanent. I didn't celebrate any of it. There were nights I missed him enough to have to remind myself why the bed was empty. Moments I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too final, too unwilling to give a scared person room to fix what he'd broken. Then I'd remember exactly how calm he sounded, saying the word divorce. Not like fear, not like a man out of options, but like a tool he'd picked up because he thought it would work. That was the part I couldn't argue myself out of. Months after everything was finalized, he sent one last message. Still at his parents'? Still job hunting? Still asking why I'd cut him out completely? Still asking if I really meant never speaking to him again? I sat at my desk, in the office he'd once promised to someone else without asking me, and typed and deleted a dozen different answers. Every one of them felt like reopening a door I'd already spent months closing. So I turned my phone face down and went back to work. That Sunday, I cooked for myself, opened the window because the apartment was warm, and sat at the table alone. Not the tense silence that used to fill the place, just quiet. The dishwasher hummed. A car alarm went off outside. My office door stood open down the hall, the way it always used to before any of this started, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like something worth noticing rather than something to defend. I thought about what would have happened if I'd panicked and said yes that night. His friend in my workspace, me working from the kitchen while carrying most of the bills, my husband still insisting it was all temporary while the weeks quietly turned into months. Maybe he'd have found a job quickly, maybe not. Either way, I'd have learned something I never wanted to know, that threatening to leave me was an effective way to get what he wanted, and that once it worked once, there would always be another room, another compromise, another version of the same threat waiting behind it. That was the future I refused. I think about that Sunday a lot. Not the ultimatum itself, but the version of my life that almost happened, because I was tired, because I loved him, because it felt easier in the moment to just say yes. It's strange how close I came to signing away the one room in that apartment that was entirely mine, just to keep the peace for a few more weeks. I don't think he ever understood that it was never really about square footage. It was about the fact that the first real crisis of our marriage he solved by handing away something of mine without asking, and then punished me for noticing. I finished dinner, put the plate in the dishwasher, and left his message unanswered.